Now this exercise is called a deadlift. And a lot of you who've been dealing with lower back pain or have a weak low back, have a bad low back as you call it, a lot of you have been told that you shouldn't be doing this, or when you've gone back to try it as one of your lower back exercises, it ends up making you feel worse the next day. In this video, I'm going to show you some of the changes that we can do to this exercise to make it more productive and to make it so it actually strengthens your back versus provoking it. Now in this video, I'm going to show you 5 of my secret, but no longer secret tips about how to get deadlifting back into your program despite having a weak or sensitive lower back. The steps we're going to cover is number 1, finding the right foot position. Number 2 is going to be finding the appropriate bar height for you. Number 3 is about making your form and tension better by something called lifter's wedge. Number 4 is not getting silly, and I'll explain that more when we get to it. And last but not least, at the very end, I'm going to reveal some secret tips that I think are going to provide some insight about why this is probably bothering your lower back in the first place. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to use something called a quad rock to actually assess position a little bit better. So here we have the quad rock. Just do it with me. Do some general movements with the quad rock. And this is a baseline hip assessment and position assessment for the feet. And what you're going to notice is when you go through a certain amount of depth, just like I do, at some point my low back does round, okay? And you're going to notice that actually if you have different knee and foot positions, that the round actually lessens, okay? If your knees are generally more inward than your feet, it'll round sooner. And so what this demonstrates is foot positions and hip positions which are allowing for more hip movement. So if we look at from the back side here, you're going to notice that when you go here, you'll probably have some range of motion. And if you go a little wider here, you may have more range of motion or you may not. So using this basic assessment, we can kind of get an idea of how deep you can go or where the stance is going to be. And this is something we use with the squat pattern as well. Now the way we use that foot position information is going to be if you had better range of motion, which most people don't. With a narrow stance, you'd probably be here. With a conventional deadlift, a lot of times people will set up a little bit more narrow than they probably should. And actually if they go a little bit here, they'll probably feel a little bit better. And sometimes people feel a little bit better even here. You can flare the feet a little bit, which helps out with externally rotating the hips. And as long as your knees and feet are stacked over each other as you're moving, then you're probably going to be okay. If you notice that you're having a little bit of cave when you do so, then this is probably not the right position for you since you're going to have abnormal forces at the knee and you're going to lose power. Step 2 is going to be about bar height, okay? So you notice on me that this bar is actually kind of at like my lower shins. And if we talk to the manufacturer of these plates, and most plates in the US, it's going to be probably about the same. And this is going to be roughly about a little over 8 inches height from the ground where my hands contact, which is too low for most people, but it's the standard for the barbell sport. Now, if you're going to do a barbell sport, this is a part that you probably can't change too much because in your sport, you actually have to lift it from the floor. But if you don't, and you're like most people who are just trying to use the exercise to feel physically able, we can change this. Now, if you get the bar height into like about here to here, about an inch above and below the knee, we call this the opportunity zone. This is where you have still a lot of benefit from the hip range of motion and the hip dominant movement. Again, it's not a low back dominant movement, and we'll cover that in a second. You still get a lot of benefit from the hip dominant movement, but you also don't sacrifice the low back form. And it mainly comes in the form of you're not going quite so low. And I'd venture to say from a normal scenario where people are picking things up off the ground, most things are like you're picking up a child here, right? Like you're picking up a bag in the yard. They're high anyways, right? But when you get into the gym here, this is kind of an unknown territory for a lot of people. So the easiest thing is just to raise the bar. So I have a couple blocks right here that we have standard at our facility. And these are, I think, 6-inch blocks. And you're going to notice that it's actually still a little bit low for me. But based upon the measurement, you're going to see it's much, much higher. So I'm still a little bit below the opportunity zone, but I know from history in my hip mobility, I can take this, okay? Some of you, though, may have to elevate a little bit more. And you don't necessarily need to build blocks or have blocks, but you can use parts of the squat rack called the safety pins or the safety bars. you can use those and just make sure that you're stabilize the bar, don't let it roll around if you're actually on the safety bars. Or you can put other plates down below. Now, if you're a barbell athlete or you want to get back into that, then you're going to have to get lower. But in the beginning stages, all we want is for you to have successful repeat experiences with the gym, period. Because a lot of times when you guys have been taking time off, you actually lose the tissue tone in your low back, which makes it so the exercise itself is a lot for the low back because your back is weak. If we strengthen up the back with just doing the movement itself, not through the provocative range, then you'll probably have a lot more wins over your lifetime. For number 3 is mainly about form and then developing tension after you get the form right. I prefer to show form first, mainly because if you can't get the form or it bothers you to do the form, maybe adding weight to the exercise is not the best thing anyways. Then once you start getting it, you can add tension to the object, the bar, and then the floor, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. I like to use a dowel as a teaching tool for form. And so similar to the spine, you should keep the dowel straight and not moving through the lift. Now, it's really popular for people to have a rounded back, low back deadlift, and they get away with it for a long time. I'd venture to say it's probably not what you want to do, especially if you have a sensitive back. And so we may as well use a neutral spine approach, just like so, where the contact point is the back of the head, the mid-back, and then the crease of the butt cheeks here. You're going to notice that I start losing form here, and I'll lose a contact point somewhere. Right? You see me lose it at the bottom there, so I'm rounding my low back. So you can use this as a teaching tool in the very beginning, but once you got it, you don't need to start warming up with that. It's a skill set that you can get and keep. Okay? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to develop tension, and we're actually going to use the bar for it. Something that's kind of unknown is that the deadlift is actually no different than a wedge and a plank. So at the top, you're going to be planking, and so with the plank, if you look at me here, there's a line from my ankles to my knees, to my hips, to my rib cage, to my shoulders, to my head, right? And my hands are kind of in the mix of it here. They're kind of like so. It's not like this. It's not like this. So if you see all these big flares and lines and contortions and stuff like that, essentially if you work on doing a plank and your plank is good, you should be able to acquire that plank in a standing position with weight on it now, okay? So doing this with just movement first, so you get the wedge here, and then the plank, the wedge, and then the plank should give you a basic scenario. Obviously, you should already have the bar height up to where you want it. You should already have the foot position because we already talked about that. The next thing you can do is actually create tension into the wedge. Now, a secret is that a lot of people actually end up having back problems when they get the weight or unbreak the weight from the floor or the platform. So what you can do is you can set what we call pre-tension, all right? It's almost like if you were gonna pull a truck and you had like a rope, you wouldn't just start running and try to like let the rope pull all at one time. Like you'd tension against it and start leaning. And so the same thing happens here. So you can slide the hands down, bury them into the bar, and then try to break the bar here, which engages the lats. The lat goes around the low back here, and if I were to bend the bar, you'll notice that my low back kind of flattens itself. And so I have some protection there inherently around the low back for that reason. And so I would bend the bar and then push the floor away. Bend the bar, push the floor away. Now, bending the bar also takes the slack out of the bar. I don't know if you guys can hear it. You hear that clink, that clunk in there, right? And so if you kind of take the slack out of the bar and it starts to raise itself. Now, creating tension here from the bar is just one part. But there's also floor tension here. Now, I learned this as rooting. So rooting is almost like if you have your feet in the ground and they grew roots all amongst all your toes and your heels and your inner arch and so on. You're growing roots there and they're kind of spreading out, right? Now, when you do the lift, you want to see if you can root deep into the earth and then try to kind of turn the earth underneath your feet without moving your feet. Remember, the roots are stuck in. So the intention is to outward turn or rip the floor underneath your feet. So here's what this would look like. I'm going to ignore the tension up here just for show. So I would bury all my roots in here and I would start to tension into the floor, and you'll notice that the activity of the musculature up into your leg actually increases. For a lot of times for people with lower back discomfort, this ends up helping out that quite a bit. Now we can link in tension and tension here. So position, tension, push, keep the tension until the load is gone. So just supplying tension is a big win for people, and that's what we call lifter's wedge. That was from Stuart McGill. Thank you so much, Mr. McGill, for doing all this work. Now the last thing before we move away from rooting here is I just want to draw your attention to, we did some B-roll about how people lean back into their heels. This is a sign of unrooting, and this is also a sign of using your low back in the lift. So you need to make sure that your toes are actually buried in as well, and make sure all those roots are actually doing the work. The last thing here too, before we leave the form and tension part, is that that plank thing that we talked about, that bend point, it may not only happen at the top. And so we talked about this kind of having here like this rib flare and this like duck butt type of scenario. Like if you look at my back, it's pretty bent in there, right? Sometimes people actually, when they come up, so I have my whole torso moving together, they actually won't just bend at the hips. They'll actually initiate the lift at their back, all right? Now, if I were to do, I can tell you right now, like I'm doing this without the bar, it kind of sucks already, right? Now imagine doing this over and over again and wondering why your back is feeling terrible after the lift anyways. So this can happen with squats as well. So make sure to keep an eye on that, and the way that you solve that is going to be generating tension through the floor and making sure that you know the basics of how the movement is anyways. It's a wedge and a plank, okay? Not a wedge and a slither, okay? Now the last few things we're gonna go through are actually not gonna be technique-based, but they're mainly just how to accomplish the lift with safety. So I say the step 4 is kind of about like not getting silly, and let's not disregard like basic principles of lifting. So number 1 is part of this is you gotta kind of earn the right to get into the bar and get into heavy weights. I know a lot of people that I've worked with before that they just simply use the dowel for a week or so, and I remember in high school we'd use a dowel before you actually got in to go in the weight room. You have to demonstrate proper form. So use the dowel. It should not feel painful to use the dowel. If you're using the dowel, which is basically no weight, then you're probably bending at the spine somehow, right? There's another fundamental form issue. And if you have problems with that, you can certainly reach out to us and we can do some one-on-one programming for it or one-on-one coaching. The other thing too is that when you actually get to the bar, work with an empty bar first, because it is 45 pounds, and then go to a bar that I like to load the bar here, this is going to be 10 pounds per side, mainly to establish height. And we're trying to figure out what height works for you, and then you can move on to things like blocks if you really can't tolerate it from the floor, especially with varying your foot position and foot flare. I would honestly do probably lighter weights for at least a couple months prior to going up too much. Ideally, what we want for people who are suffering with lower back ongoing issues and they get frustrated really easily by having problems after lifting is we want repeated successful experiences at the gym. The weight really doesn't matter for the most part. Your body may be deconditioned. We're just building up general competencies. We're building up tissue tone. We're not really working on too much strength or increase in muscle size. We're just getting you to go back into it. I remember when I first started going back into the gym after having a back issue, I would look at the whole gym as like a buffet. I don't know what I want yet. I'm going to do random junk and see which ones work well for me. And the deadlift may not be one of them that works really well for you just yet. So maybe pattern it in, add a little bit of weight, add a little bit of height, and after a few months of being able to do that, let's see if we can add a little bit of weight onto that then at that point. The next thing you can do is actually, if you get into the point where you're actually into a little bit more weight, but you're having trouble later in the set, is we can do something called clustering the set. And so clustering the set is, let's just say you want to do a rep of 5, but you can't get to 5 because your back bothers you doing that, but the first 3 are okay. Do 3, wait a couple minutes or even 30 seconds, and then do 2. Waiting just a little bit of time, maybe enough to flush oxygen into the musculature to give it a little bit better stamina to stabilize your spine prior to doing the lift. Because there may be a scenario where your back is failing prior than the hips. And that is, if that's the case, it's okay. We can make sure that it condition the back, but maybe don't blow the back out of the water just to do the lift to get to the legs. The last thing that people get really silly on is they see these random videos on YouTube and Instagram. I know this is one of them. But the programming is really bad and the use of the exercise is bad. Now, from a weight training perspective, the reason I would use a barbell like so, is to load it heavier. To load it heavier, we're probably talking about strength work. To do strength work, we're probably talking about under 25 reps total, and we're probably cutting those 25 reps into 5 sets or so, maybe even 3 sets, and then you put 8 in there or so. But they kind of have a saying, like you shouldn't go above 10 if you're working on strength, right? Even power should be much lower. And so if we're really working on building strength with this type of exercise, then maybe we should really work strength. Like you shouldn't be doing 25 reps in a row. You shouldn't be doing 50 reps in a row. You should be staggering them and getting 5 and 3 sets in. And cluster that set if you really need to. But if you're abusing the exercise, there's a chance that it just hurts you just because your reps and sets aren't right too. Now lastly, the secrets that I want to share that I think a lot of you won't be aware of is actually the reason why your back probably hurts with the lift in the first place. Many people, including in sports, unless trauma-based, they bring their injury to the sport, okay? They sit a lot, they sit 40, 50 hours a week because they have day jobs, they're recreational athletes, and they go into the gym and they think this will make them healthy. And the fact of the matter is they lack good tissue preparedness. They sit a lot throughout the day, so their hips are stiff, and then they try to do a hip dominant movement, and then their hips are stiff, so the work shifts around into the lower back, creating a lower back lift, not a hip lift. Again, a deadlift has gotten a bad reputation over the years as being detrimental to your back. It's actually the opposite. A deadlift from the lower back, yes, can be painful and detrimental, but a hip dominant deadlift with good form can actually be very helpful, and it can be something that actually solves some of your back stiffness that's ongoing. All right, guys, I hope you liked this video, and if you want one-on-one coaching from us, in person or virtual, reach out to us in the link description and subscribe to the channel. I have a lot more videos coming out like this on various different topics, such as squatting and planking and bridging and so on. We get into a lot. Put your comments in the box below, and let me know which exercises you want me to cover. I'd love to cover them all for you, but I really need to know what you want to do at the gym. Take care.